anti-colonial struggle. But so today I'm not going to talk about that aspect of my work, and I'm mostly going to focus on the work we're doing more collectively with the Finalist, which is now a magazine that comes out every other month, both in print and paper versions. Print and online version. But that originally started as a small blog in which I was writing since 2007. That got complemented with a podcast in 2013 that has now something like, I don't know, like 150 episodes, something like that. And then the magazine emerged in 2015 and has continued since then. We recently released our 32nd issue, so it's been quite a trip, and it's going to continue to be. And so what I thought I'd be doing today to talk specifically about internationalist solidarity is to prepare a talk where I would take some of those issues and maybe present them briefly to you with this sort of international solidarity strategy in mind. So the first group that I pointed out is in this establishing of relations, establishing of solidarity, and establishing a connection and dialogue. This first category is about maybe taking one particular political struggle. Many of our issues would be about anti-colonialism. This one is an example. It's our January-February 2017 issue dedicated to it was called Islands, but maybe it could have been a little bit more explicit and talking about anti-colonial struggles on small islands of the world. And as you can see a little bit on the index, each time I'm going to present an issue, I'm going to show you the cover, the index, and then a few pages inside. And so yes, typically this issue was a way to very much talk about, promote, and be in solidarity with political struggles, anti-colonial struggles, sometimes directly from indigenous people of a country, of an island in that case. So those are four of the examples that we've been having within those issues. One about the U.S. occupation of Hawaii. One about the French colonial occupation of the Comorian island of Mayotte, so it's still a French colony today, despite Comoros being an independent country. One being another example of U.S. imperialism, colonialism in Puerto Rico, and similarly, so I could have taken maybe examples that do not always involve the U.S., but also an article on Okinawa. Talking about Japanese colonialism, Japanese nationalism, and U.S. imperialism in that context. So this one, as far as anti-colonial struggles are concerned, I think I could have taken quite a few issues we did on the topic, but I wanted to present this one. But then on another topic, we had this 13th issue in September-October 2017. Called the title is a bit strange. Maybe I would not name it the exact same way today, but called Queers, Feminists, and Interiors. The notion of interiors is a bit secondary here. It was a way to bring back space in the topic, but I don't think interiors is such an important notion in this title. The queer and feminist struggle would be are much more prominent in this issue. Sorry. And so each time, because originally the Finalist comes from the world of architecture, even though it really has only a few toes left in that world. They're solidly anchored toes, I would say, but they're. I think the dialogues we want to be involved with are much more outside of the world of architecture, and sometimes involve a few architects, but they do not really it does not really happen within the discipline. But so each time we're trying to bring back space sometimes in a very explicit way, sometimes in a more implicit way, as a way to maybe to give relevance to what could be our contribution to this. In addition of thinking always internationally, internationalistically, I would say, bringing back space is something that we know we can do relatively well, so to speak. So I mean, this issue had various articles. Here are just a few of them, thinking of in particular the bathrooms, and it was at a moment where North Carolina in the US was just putting in place some transphobic legislation with regards to the use of bathrooms, but also thinking of domestic workers' bedroom. I mean, sometimes we can barely call it a room, but in Hong Kong, that could have been true in other places. We will soon have a similar article in Beirut, for example. And various articles of the kind that all have more often than not a feminist and queer perspective on the matter, but sometimes either or. A third example of this category, third and last example of this category, had to do with ableism. So the normative system that sort of distribute, if I say it this way, distribute a proportional degree of violence to people who are proportionally distant from this norm in physical manner. So the idea of thinking something that's very obvious for anyone who has think politically or experience ableism, but that's probably worse to recall, which is that disability only exists in relation to a system. Disability does not exist in a vacuum. And so, and architecture, of course, is one, and space are two dimensions that are incredibly reinforcing this system of normative violence towards bodies that are further away from the norm of ableism than others. And so we had again various articles dealing with disability in general as a social category, but also looking at more specific categories of what would be called disabilities, whether it's deafness or age or illness or and also, of course, maybe the ability to walk or to experience space in a way that able bodies usually take for granted. So that was the first category to maybe think of how can we put in dialogue some various political struggles that are all linked in the way that they are fighting against the same sort of system of violence. Another way to do this, something we do quite often, is the idea of establishing relations and dialogues between similar strategies of struggles. So that's something that we actually did very deliberately all along the year of 2019. Like, we decided that the 6 issues of 2019 were going to have this approach. Also because 2019 started with our 21st issues that I'll talk about in just a second. But then until then, the 21st issues, we realized that they might have done a pretty good job, hopefully, at analyzing systems of violence, systems of oppression, sometimes in great details and sometimes with fresh new take on the matter. But we had not maybe spent enough time looking at the struggles themselves and trying to encourage this solidarity and creativity within struggle. So that's why we did a full year dedicated to 6 different dimensions of political struggle. So one had to do with space. I'll talk about it in a minute. One had to do with the idea of publishing. One had to do with architectures themselves, even though it's not easy. I feel for me it was a bit of a. It was showing me a little bit that I was not quite ready to go back to the world of architecture and having perspective only from architects. And then we did an issue that I really like. That's called Futurism, that I'll be presenting a little bit later. One had to do with the idea of violence in the context of self-defense. And the last one of the year was talking about pedagogies, and the whole issue was made for us 18 to 14 years old readership. So I'll talk about it later as well. So presenting a little bit more into details, three of those 6. This one about space was really, really interesting. I felt I had a lot of pleasure and interest in editing it. And it had to do with the idea of how do political struggles find creative strategies to use space for their advantage and not be and I mean in my research and writing work I tend to say that architecture is going to be almost always a weapon of the powerful. But space is a bit different than architecture. Of course, it's not radically different, but it's a little bit different. And so, looking at how political struggles were able to really take space to appropriate themselves a space, or to organize from a space, or to really consider space as an important component of what they could intervene into was something very interesting. So we talked about prison abolition in California. We talked about the Zapatista struggle in Chiapas, in the south of Mexico. We talked about the banlieues, the suburbs of France, and in Paris in particular. We talked about Kashmir. We talked about the Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau anti-colonial revolution in the 60s, as well as the Occupy movement in London, and each time have someone either from the inside or someone who's who has worked a lot on those particular struggles to tell us a little bit how space was thought and appropriated in each of those. As I said, another one that was really great that year was the one on Futurism. The idea that political struggles also need a way to project themselves in the future, whether it's fictional, and more often than not it is, or it's a little bit more speculative, or then there's always a need to be able to imagine further somehow, and so it was really also a very, very nice issue to work on, asking ourselves, what does that mean for Palestinians what will happen to Palestinians when they'll be free, thinking of other indigenous futures, in particular with Lakota artists in North America, Susan Kite, thinking of Afrofuturism with the wonderful Rashida Phillips, thinking of Maori futurism with Jessica Coco-Ansel, thinking of queer futurity with Tariq Lakrisi and various others. As I talked about, we had one dedicated to a very young audience, which I thought was a very interesting challenge and endeavor. And so what happened is that we had a few texts written by say, late teenagers, like between, I think the youngest might have been 18 and the oldest 20, around the world. I mean, one in Hong Kong, one in London, one in Ecuador, one in Martinique, and one in the United States. I mean, between Iran and the United States. And then we had like a main dossier, so to speak, with text written for this 8 to 14 years old audience about South African apartheid, about métisness, what I would say. I mean, the idea of having multiple ethnic heritage, especially in a colonial context like French Polynesia. Talking about the story of Christopher Columbus, but from the perspective of the indigenous people of Haiti, and a great contribution by trans writer Adèle Tincelin, along with his daughter Charlie Tincelin, who worked together on a text on gender. And one last that I wanted to present within this category of of thinking of like one particular strategy of political struggle is one of the most recent one we did, July-August 2020, about reparations. That came at it was quite a coincidence because of course we start preparing an issue 6 months in advance, but that came very much at the height of the Black Lives Matter uprising in the US and around the world, and came as a sort of brought its humble little contribution in the large debate of how to decolonize and dismantle white supremacy in an actual operative way, and not in a solely symbolic way. So reparations would be part of this. And it mobilized various geographies. It was not simply Black geographies, but looking at Hawaii, Afro-Caribbean, Aboriginal people in Australia. We've been working a lot on the question of reparations, and various other places, and involving various other nations that have a relationship to this idea of reparation. Third and last group I wanted to point out, which is another sort of editorial tactics that we've been using 3 times so far, which is to talk about this international solidarity around a specific geography. Like, so starting from one geography in particular, and seeing how we can frame international solidarity from or with this given geography. So the first one I can talk about is the only issues that we open to guest editing by indigenous activists and scholars Melanie Yazzie and Nick Estes. Nick had been writing for us for quite a few times beforehand, and we wanted to give them their whole issue, so to speak. I mean, to work with them on a full issue on the question of settler colonialism in Turtle Island. So Turtle Island being one of the indigenous name of North America, and so they put together an issue talking about, in particular, about towns, because very often we tend to sort of restrain indigenous struggles, especially in the US and Canada, to reservations themselves, and when actually most of the indigenous people live in cities where they are subjected to police harassment, if not police murders, as well as various form of precariousness. That all goes back to the idea of the settler colonial status that that countries like Canada and the US, and Canada is maybe having a lesser hard time to acknowledge itself as such, even though it doesn't really change things at the end of the day. But even though more and more people in the United States are thinking of themselves as settlers, I mean, depending on who they are, of course, but many people would sort of understand themselves as at least being involved within a settler colonial system. This is not something that seems so obvious for so many people, which is something that we're trying to making it more obvious is already a political struggle of the kind of yeah. So in this issue they had so Nick and Melanie had written like a long and fantastic introduction, and then a lot of the conversation, as I mentioned, revolved around cities, whether it was small what's called border towns, which are the towns that are usually built completely illegally with regards to treaties that had been signed with indigenous nations in the 18th and 19th century, but in towns that are built right next to indigenous reservations, and then sometimes much bigger cities such as Los Angeles, and we had several contributions of the kind. And something you might see here is something we used to have in the I want to say maybe the 25 first issues, something like that, 24 first issues, where we had like a whole architecture student section where we would try to feature architecture students' work in relation to the topic. And we don't really do it anymore, but that doesn't mean that we would not come back to it at some point. And I'll go back a little bit later to what we did that are not completely dissimilar. Another thing we did around the topic was around the geography of Chicago itself, and it was for another architecture biennale, the Chicago Architecture Biennale, that we had been commissioned to do a book, and I'm trying to think of a way to tell the story without spending too much time on it, but essentially being part of this biennale was both for us a joy because of the fantastic work of the three curators and the guests that they had in this biennale, but also having a lot of problem with at least two things. One of them was the main sponsor of the biennale, which is BP, the British Petroleum. Thinking of in a settler colonial context where oil is one of the main infrastructure of settler colonialism, as well as Chicago itself, in a biennale that was created by Rahm Emanuel when he was the mayor of Chicago, a mayor who shut down 52 public schools, give much greater equipment and finances to the police department, and so we were wondering whether we should do it, and then if we should do it, how should we do it? And I'm already starting to talk about the very last part of this presentation, which is the sort of like the internal discussions and internal politics of producing editorial content. But this one is quite interesting in trying to think how could we editorially make it work, and we did several things that I'm happy to talk about if you have a question on the topic. But one of them was to make sure that Chicago-based activists would be involved within this book, which essentially for a lot of it is republishing some articles we had published in the past in the magazine, and doing so in a way that I particularly like, which is to ask 20 regular reader of the magazine to pick the one article that they thought was the most useful to them politically. So each, as you can see, there's like someone's choice. So that's the choice of the text that they made. And then they explain a little bit why for them this article was the most useful. So those are like the black articles. And then we have those blue articles, which are coming from Chicago activists that very much made sure that at no moment within this book we gave a break to the Chicago municipality as far as settler colonial, racist, and neoliberal policies were involved. So that's what the book looked inside. It was beautifully put together by small team made of Suzanne Labourie and Jehan Yazami. And then going back to the magazine itself, we did a second issue that was really centered on one particular geography, in that case Palestine. That was at the beginning of the year. That was our January, February 2020 issues. And this time it was made in collaboration with the Palestine Festival of Literature, where I had been invited in 2019, as well as 2020, but unfortunately it had to be cancelled with the pandemic. But in 2019, we were a group of various people coming from various places of the world and coming to Palestine. I mean, the whole Festival of Literature is about, of course, bringing people from around the world talking about colonialism in particular to a Palestinian audience, but also to have people who, for the most part, I mean, I was kind of an exception in that matter, but for many of them had never been to Palestine, and sort of making them like showing them around and showing them the various apparatuses of settler colonialism there, but also making them see the country itself, I suppose. And so for me, it was important to make an issue of the magazine based on what we had, on the dialogue that we had already started during the time of the festival. And so all of the contributions in this issue are actually dialogues between a Palestinian person and a guest of the Palestinian literature, the Palestine Festival of Literature. And so that created like a very nice, very easy to read as well, because, you know, all our articles are really edited in such a way that they would be easy to read. They're not academic. They're really getting rid of all jargon or anything of the kind. Like all the language is supposed to be very, very simple to grasp. But I suppose this one was in particular because it was dialogue between people, between two persons each time, and there was something quite beautiful about it, really. And then a third one is the one that we very recently released, our current issue of November-December 2020, around the idea of Pan-Africanism, centered, of course, on the African continent, but also in the Black diaspora all around the world. And that was trying to center Blackness, of course, and center the African continent in particular, center the anti-colonial history of the African continent, and of the diaspora, because we have a full piece on the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century, but also to show how the Pan-African struggle is and should be an inspiration to everyone around the world. So those are a few of the contribution within it that were written also by people either from the diaspora or from the continent. And when I say the diaspora, I don't mean simply the United States. I, of course, mean North America, but also South America, and in particular Brazil, and the Caribbean, and also Europe, and even though it no longer qualifies a diaspora, also trying to include nations that sort of identify themselves as Black, and I'm thinking in particular of Australian Aboriginal people. And sort of like, so this one is quite interesting because even though it is centered on a geography of some sort, and I mean the cover shows the African continent, it is a sort of very dissolving geography because it's a geography that exists with Black people all around the world in all the many places that Black people would be. And this particular issue was for all the 31 first issue. I was the only editor-in-chief involved, but this issue we decided to do it together with the little team that we are. That I'll show you in just a second. But so there was 3 editors-in-chief: Margarita Nzuzi-Wako, Caroline Honorien, and myself. So last part of this small presentation, I see that I'm doing not so badly in terms of time, so that's great. Which is to talk about what I call the behind the scenes, because all I showed so far was very sort of content based and like editorial positioning and editorial constructing and everything. But then I am absolutely convinced that what's going on behind the scenes and the way we produce this content should also reflect on solidarity and have the same sort of political standards that our content has, so to speak. So when I talk about behind the scenes, I owe to present a little bit the team, which for as it exists currently, as I said, is made out of Margareta Nzuzi-Wako, Caroline Maria, and myself, as well as at the moment we're being joined by Ahmed Hajjassan, who's our intern. We have what I call an accompanying team, which could be called almost an editorial board made out of former members of the team, which are Noël Geller, Flora Yacon, and Nadia Lakim. And then all together, the six of us on the left are meeting once a year to sort of workshop around the future of the magazine and all this. So it's really great it's been quite a great process to go from being completely by myself to work on that, to like be a real team and to be able to sort of think of this together and all this. And then we have regular collaborators like our copy editor, Carol Quay, and one of our most regular contributing translators, Chanel Adams, most regular because she translates usually from French to English, and two of us are based in Paris, and the magazine in general is mostly centered. Its base is mostly centered in Paris, even though Margareta Wako is in Copenhagen. And so it happens quite often that we would ask someone around us to write, and they would not necessarily write in English. So we have something I won't be talking about today, but that is always a recurring question in all our conversation, have to do with language as well. I think no one has any problem in most of what we do to be in English, but that's also, when you're situated somewhere else, and also you don't want necessarily to take English as some sort of default, and it involves other questions. In terms of the geographies involved, this is the map of all our articles in the magazine so far, and for me that's always a very useful map because it's both whenever I see that map, I simultaneously have like excitement and enthusiasm, and also I'm cringing my teeth. Excitement because I feel that we've been, we've definitely not been censoring everything we did on global North issues, and always it could have been very easy. I used to live in the US, so it would have been very easy to like always have like a very sort of France and US centered editorial line. Even though, as you can see, it's far from not being the case either. But so a bit of excitement, I suppose, in seeing all this constellation of places that we mobilized within the magazine, but also too cringing because there are many places. Not that the goal is to talk about everywhere. That's not. At least it's not the goal for the sake of talking everywhere. It's just that if we there are many places that we have not mobilized so far in the magazine. South America is certainly one, and since I'm speaking here at the Tbilisi's Architecture Biennial, I have to confess quite shamefully that we haven't, both Georgia and the region in general, we haven't really mobilized it much in the a little bit Armenia, but and of course Turkey, but that's about it. So I think even though there is very sort of understandable reasons for that matter, which a lot has to do with my own subjectivity, my own visits to various places of the world, and my own sort of community of friends and people who could help for that matter. Let's say, even though there's those reasons, those are absolutely no excuse in having like entire places of Earth not being really in our radar, if I say it in a weird way. So yeah, so that's, when I say successes and failures, that's a little bit this kind of dialectic of things that not being always like self-critiquing, but also having our self-critical gaze quite on all the time. Events have been this slide looks a little bit strange in 2020, where of course only one event was able to happen in February before we many of us were being contained within our own homes. But events in various places of the world has been always like a good way to also engage with conversation and creating international solidarity. Contributors themselves, of course, as well. In particular, within our own politics of choosing who our contributors are, because here again, it would be very easy, like to only have people from a few universities of the global north writing about various topics. But I think whenever we're trying to have this slide and this slide coincide as much as possible, to have people, when people write about somewhere, they're deeply connected, whether by family or national histories or by maybe more adoptive situations, but that's incredibly important for us to have like incarnated perspective on the situation we're describing. So they're choosing who might write a text about somewhere something is always like a very important question, even though at the end of the day, it's more often than not it would be. It would not. I mean, it would be a fairly organic thing to do, and then quite a decent amount of our contributors have contributed more than once for the magazine. So once we worked with them, we also like to like create this sort of ties and friendship sometimes. And from this to there is quite important, because so far. Because a lot of our, if I'm going back to here, a lot of our contributors are young people. Not that age is the only criterion that matters here, but the fact is that we're not, more often than not, we're not necessarily commissioning articles from people who already have made a name. I don't really like this expression, but made a name around a particular topic or something. And so we are often in the situations where we would be able to recommend people for a project or a job or an event or something like that. And this is something deeply important, I think, in what we're trying to do, is to think really of those contributors that are being somehow community. For those of them who sort of wants to be part of this community, I mean, it's also very tangible whenever we're in dialogue with any of those contributors, to see whether there is this sort of like common interest in maybe doing more together and all this, or if it's just like a one-time collaboration that does not necessarily require more, which is also completely fine, of course. But so when we feel there is this sort of that community-driven desire, let's say, between us, I think it's always very important for us to also promote our contributors' work. In particular, again, those who might have not been publishing in many places before and might be a bit young and all that. and so one of our future project, which is, I mean, near future now, it should happen in the next couple of months, really. We've been working on it for over a year now, is what we call the Finalist Network, which will allow for people to search our contributors and to explore this community through their work, or through where they are, through their new achievement, like books and stuff like that, but also really just like make them include them within a network that would allow anyone who's organizing like events, or who's looking to fill a position somewhere, and to put them in relation with someone that we think would be really great for what they're looking for. Of course, insofar that what they're looking for is an interesting thing for the person as well, of course. Almost finished. Maybe I was trying to think of other things we're trying to do to think of international solidarity, and this little podcast series in French. We have two little podcast series in French going back to the idea of language that we started maybe a year ago, maybe a bit less than a year ago, I think, which is called Diasporas and Imaginary of the Struggles in the Context of France. And this one is a very, very nice series. I really like it. I mean, it's essentially the idea is that within the anti-racist and anti-colonial activism in France, we tend to have in the imaginaries a pretty good representation of people coming from diasporas of the Maghreb, so like the North Africa, of the sub-Saharan West Africa, and the Afro-Caribbean, but perhaps a bit less from other diasporas. And so we try to have like a few episodes of podcast telling us a bit more about the diaspora itself, but also telling us about the imaginary of struggles that each diaspora member sort of carry with them. So we talked about Comorians, we talked about Tamils, we talked about Portuguese, about Peruvian, Afghanis, and then one that's about to be published is about the Turkish diaspora. One that I'm recording tomorrow is about the Armenian diaspora, with, of course, a very strong current struggle in your southern neighbor's country, and so this is interesting to me because it's supposed to be really, really useful within the context of French anti-racist and anti-colonial organizing. But I think it does even a bigger job at thinking of international solidarity. And I don't know. I mean, it's also, I've been learning a lot from doing this series, because each time I'm sort of starting a project, in particular a podcast project, that's also a way for me to learn about things, and it's been a wonderful experience. And then one of the most recent projects we've been doing is also to go back sometimes a little bit to architecture, in particular after having noticed that how there are some young architects that just graduated from school or were still a little bit at school around the world, who are just doing absolutely outstanding work, and outstanding work in an outstanding understanding of the politics of architecture. And so that prompted us to do this small series promoting 16 of them, coming from different countries in the world. I mean, admittedly, there's still quite a few people who come from UK or US schools, but really not only. And in particular, the most represented school is the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg, which is really an incredible place ever since Leslie Loco has been creating this new program in which students and in particular Black students are getting their work and their story valued in such a way that it becomes really a driving force in their architecture and in their interpretation of what architecture does in society. So that was important. So when we come back to really in the world of architecture, that would be through this kind of action that has somehow to do with international solidarity as well. I see that I talked for 50 minutes, so I'm gonna stop here, and I would value any questions you might have. It's a little bit strange to have to do it without seeing anyone on the other side of the screen, but hopefully there was more than 4 or 5 people, and if it was just you, Tinatana, I guess that's fine too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leopold. No, there were actually quite some people watching, and now whoever is watching us, I would encourage to ask some questions in the comments that I will read out loud. That would be really, really good if you would ask some questions now. Yeah, thank you so much for this very, very interesting coverage or like overview of the entire Funambulist magazine and all the issues. I had a few questions during your presentation, but then slowly you answered them. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm really, really personally very, very grateful to you and your team for this international solidarity and how you are trying to cover and bring some voices that I don't know. Me personally, when I read the new issue of the Funambulist, it's always something that I haven't heard of before. So for me, it's really something as an alternative news somehow. And I think it's really, really important. And another thing that you mentioned, that you've gone a bit far from architecture. I kind of see it the other way around. I think because you always stick to the space, I think it's not going far, but it's very important to touch these topics in the frames of architecture, or like us who are trained architects, to speak about these topics. I find it really, really important. And
maybe an easy way I would say I would talk about that was to say that I used to want to bring politics within architecture, and now I'm more interested in bringing architecture to politics. That's sort of that there was a shift at some point.
Yeah, great. That's really interesting shift, I think. And I find it also very, very interesting. And I would also kind of form a question out of it, how in each issue you show the map differently, a distorted map, like the map of the world that we don't usually see, because for me, it's more like opening up my mind to see other places and not always like seeing the center. I totally follow and understand the struggles because I also come from the country that also is considered as a periphery. We also suffer from the colonialism. So I find it really, really interesting how these minorities are brought together into the magazine. So what is this the idea of the map, that you always like show the different types of map, you turn it around, and I really found it very interesting each time when I opened the magazine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was something that that was quite deliberate at first, and that just became very organic since then, which is really that there. I mean, especially when specifically when we're talking about the world, there is no projection, mapping projections that will be anyway faithful to the actual to the actual proportion of the world. The only way to show the actual representation of the world is through a sphere always. So that's why we have our little sphere maps. But so I think it's a way to choose other orientation and other projection than the one that perhaps we tend to be surrounded by, at least in a sort of global north context. But I think it's also it's not much more sophisticated than just realizing at some point of our lives that the way the place where we grew up has its own way of showing the world, and then a place a few thousand kilometers away would have like another place. So it's part of this, and also having the north in another direction than the top of the screen or the top of the paper is also a way to initiate this kind of doubt over what it is we usually see, and to open imaginaries, and to in a place like Palestine, for example, that perhaps I can talk about. The map of Palestine, I mean, Palestine has been so much represented in a cartographic way that it's very, very, very hard to liberate our spirit from like those very hard borders and apartheid wall that surrounds the Gaza Strip, and that does not even surround that very much colonize the West Bank. And so somehow doing this very simple gesture, which is to never show Palestine with the north on top, already allows for this of this border in the imaginary to be able to disappear potentially. So yeah, but I feel a bit embarrassed to talk about it more than 2 minutes, because it's really just a small little thing to open imaginaries that I think is not like is something that is very the only thing that's not organic about all this is to always pick the same kind of projection and always have the north on top, which is what usually people have to do. Yeah.
Yes, I'm checking if there are some questions. I don't see any questions.
Okay. I have an afternoon of baking planned up, so I can get to it otherwise.
Sorry?
I have an afternoon of baking after that planned up, so I can start whenever people want me to start.
Great. Yeah. Well, I really have so many questions. I haven't read all the issues, but I have read some that also it was very, very interesting for me. For example, as a few years ago, series of terrorist attacks happened in France and in Brussels. So I think you were writing an article about the suburbs of Brussels, where I don't know if they're also called banlieues like in Paris, but so where this terrorists come from, like with the spaces. So for example, for me, this was very, very interesting to connect the spaces with what was happening, and also ask questions like if the spaces and if architecture and built environment, how it influences as well. How can this be also influencing thing for for example, terrorism, one might say, I don't know, but yeah, this kind of suburbs, it's really, I think, interesting topic in like in Paris for sure. So maybe you could, do you remember that article? And
yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
It was a text on Molenbeek, which is really not a suburbs. It's very much part of the Brussels
okay.
of the Brussels sort of central urban fabric, but it is a place that has a majority of residents are coming from the Rif, so the Berber region of Morocco, completely on the north of Morocco. And out of 10,000 people living there, 10 of them happened to, and some of them were just very temporary residents, but well, 10 of them who lived there conducted the attacks in both in Paris and in Brussels. And so my comment was not really was still coming from a French perspective, because we had all the French media now using the term Molenbeek, which is the name of the neighborhood, using the term as a noun to talk about a neighborhood somewhere that those media deemed as being lost to the sort of logics of political Islamism, blah blah blah. I mean, all this sort of demagogic racism from the press, and I was showing as well how Molenbeek is also a place where that is slowly gentrifying, and how this kind of, even though the sort of logic would want that to say that, well, okay, if you're going to link a neighborhood to terrorism, you might think that it's a bad thing for gentrification, but actually it's a great thing for gentrification, because it allows a narrative in which the police can intervene with great violence without being questioned, because, you know, whenever things have to do with terrorism, then nothing gets questioned. Everybody sort of claps and agrees. And so bringing more police allows for an entire sort of replacement. I mean, which is not the case in Molenbeek. You don't have like this whole replacement, but at least a slow replacement of the population from a sort of working class, racialized working class, to a white middle class. In particular, when it's prime real estate, to use the sort of the market's words, prime real estate in a city like Brussels. Like, it's very central in Molenbeek again. So the banlieues are a little bit different in France, because the banlieues by definitions are suburbs, and by definitions are further away from the center. And by being further away from the center, they're also further away from, say, the citizenry. They're further away from any sort of public service and any sort of like economic, social, cultural life, and any sort of representation of the state, to the exception of the police, and being subjected constantly to police harassment, in particular Black, Arab, and Roma young men. And so those neighborhoods are de facto segregated from the rest of the cities, and yet some of them still. I mean, it depends. I mean, when we talk about gentrification, we have to keep it in that case within the context of Europe, which is of course not the same speed than what would happen in North America, for example, where in 5 years you can just wipe out an entire neighborhood and replace it with like white middle class. So of course, in a context like France, it takes more time to happen. But then, yeah, the closest banlieue from the city center of Paris now, after being stigmatized for years as being places where, for a long time, it was places where a lot of crime and drug trafficking was happening, to now it's quite interesting to see how the discourse changed, because now it's more about Islam, about neighborhoods where Islam would be running things and everything. So all those sort of narratives that sort of stigmatize neighborhoods to allow a higher degree of policing are always changing and always finding one new sort of reason to be doing that instead of dismantling the various approaches of segregation that exist, a lot of which has to do with architecture.
Thank you. I'm checking again, and there are unfortunately no questions.
Okay, well.
So
I'm going to interpret that as being clear. I was clear, maybe, so there's no question.
Yeah, it's also, I think, sometimes difficult to engage when you're watching from your screen. And well, I have one question, like, how do you choose the topics? Like, where do you find them, and then the contributors? Because it's always so different, and I really wonder how you find out about all these things. That would be very interesting.
I would say there's about three reasons that allows for the choice of the topic. The best one is when there's like a sort of urgency, not necessarily an urgency in terms of time, as in like something is coming up, so we need to be talking about that or something. But there's a topic that like we need to engage with, and usually that's like the most ambitious issues. I mean, I'm thinking of reparations or Pan-Africanism, for example, recently. Sometimes it's more about, okay, maybe we haven't done enough of a good work on something, so we should. It's not going to fix the fact that we haven't done a good work, but we're going to at least try to do something about it. And I think the issues that I described about ableism would be one of them. I would never claim that the Finalist has been doing a good job in terms of fighting ableism just because we did like one issue, like 1 out of 32 is just not enough. But yeah, when we did it, we definitely already had like a sort of self-critical look at what we had done so far, and therefore trying to at least address it in a bit. And then another way, I should probably not say it like that, but it's been like every 2 months for 5 years and a half, so it's a bit tiring. So some topics are also easier than others. Not necessarily easier because the topic itself is easier, but it's just the way we frame it is a little bit more open-ended. And so usually those issues, I suppose, are those that are very open-ended, such as the one we did on closing politics or object politics, or more recently food politics. Like or even the one on cartography, because many people work on cartography, so it was also very easy. I mean, this one happened because we had like a problem and we had to change. We had to decide. We had to make a full issue in 2 months when usually we have to do it on 6 months. So we needed like a topic where we knew that quite a few people out there are working on this, and but yeah, I mean, I guess the best scenario is when we feel like, okay, we have to talk about this now, and there's like this great enthusiasm as well in finding people to write for it and to engage with it, and that's always a fantastic moment when it happens. So, for example, the next issue is a bit of a mix between the urgency and the perhaps we haven't done enough on this, and it will be on labor itself. So perhaps with a Marxist, a more Marxist dimension on things, but not really a Marxist in the sort of like European left kind of approach, but a more like, again, a more internationalist examination on both exploitative conditions of labor, but also on the interconnectedness at an international level. What does that mean to be someone who work in a factory in Bangladesh, or what does that mean someone who's Moroccan and works in the fields of in the agricultural fields of Spain, or this kind of questions.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I'm very looking forward to that. Yeah, like what you just said about the labor, that's very, very also relevant to us in Georgia, because there are so many people who are working abroad since the 90s already, because we had roughly 1 million people who left the country after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and there are people mostly like living in US, or there are a lot in Greece, in Russia, in Germany. So there are like many stories behind that, and even a documentary film about it. Very interesting. So I really wish to bring you somehow also to Georgia.
I would love to, yeah.
Because I think for the magazine, you would gather a lot of interesting issues, not only in Georgia, in the region.
Absolutely.
Which you haven't covered till now so well. So yeah, I would like to offer you help in that if you're going to decide to work with the region.
Yeah.
We have so much material and already a network which would give you like very interesting contacts, or like researchers or some scholars who are discussing the similar topics as you are.
And I suppose maybe just to add to this and to go back to the previous question, which is that how do we choose a topic? It's also, we need to have something to say ourselves, like, because an editorial line, of course, is always built around one particular argument, and therefore it is an incredibly subjective endeavor, because it all revolves around this small team, and I have to say myself in particular. And so I think us engaging with a place like Armenia at the moment, for example, is a first step into understanding a little bit better how can we sort of position ourselves with regards to to the various political dimensions of the region, and therefore start to be engaged with dialogues where we're not starting from zero. Like, you're not explaining Georgia to us from I mean, it's never from zero. Of course, I remember I'm old enough to definitely remember the Russian invasion and all this, but it's quite a. I can tell that I'm not speaking about it very well right now, because it's not very clear in my head. But it's quite, each time it's quite. There are doors that sometimes open to an entire new. I don't want to say field. It sounds like a university thing, but like an entire sort of imaginary, at least. But somehow, as long as you don't have crossed the door, which is something that. We are responsible. If we're not finding the door, it's our fault. It's not other people's fault. but it's quite an interesting process to be able at some point to like open a door on something and then really enter the next phase of having all the imaginary out there. So it's so when you're saying that, that's exactly the kind of things that I could call a door. Like that's great. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, do you have maybe some question to us or some comment? Otherwise, we could sum up, and you can enjoy your Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, maybe I can ask you for some baking advice. That's where my mind will shift at in just a minute, but. No, but I'm really glad that you managed to pull the Biennial together in such a difficult year. So rather than asking you a question, I want to compliment you on making it work that way. We all would rather be all in the same room, of course, but it's it's the next best thing for sure.
Yes, thank you. And it was a big challenge, but we're also happy that we didn't give up and continued. Even though we're tired of the screen, but we're gathering a very, very rich material that we can use afterwards. So, and we really, really hope that we can next time our meeting can be in an offline world and hopefully in Georgia.
Yeah.
So we should keep in touch and wishing you all the best with the upcoming issues. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tineta.
Today.
Take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.